Hello, as once again we return to normal. Thank you for being here. Today's subject matter is something which I've spent many years trying to understand, and which I believe I'm no closer to understanding than I was at the outset. And in particular, I will be talking about antidepressants, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs, as they are known in everyday parlance. I should begin with a brief summary of my mental health history, I suppose. Before I do that, I just wanted to let you know that you can support this show on Patreon. And if you do, there are two perks that you'll get. One is access to subscriber-only episodes, and the second is access to my bulletin. Now, this bulletin will be coming out next week, and it will contain three things. 1, something that you should listen to. 2, something you should watch. And 3, something you should read. And I'll be releasing one each week, and I will provide my own interpretation and experience of consuming these things. I think it'll be a good way for you, if you're interested, to engage with a few new things each week, which are not given to you by the algorithm, but which are given to you by a person, hopefully, whose judgment is trustworthy enough for you to spend your time engaging with it. Anyway, I'm going to start very briefly with a summary, some kind of summary of my mental health history. So I suppose the main things that happened between the main psychiatric things that happened between the age of 14 and now 28, 2 or 3 diagnoses: 1, generalized anxiety disorder; 2, major depressive disorder; and 3, the infamous ADHD. Now, the first one that came up in my life was generalized anxiety disorder. Now, that's very difficult to treat for many people, perhaps even untreatable, I'm not sure. However, one thing that is very helpful for many people are kind of behavioral interventions, right? Cognitive behavioral therapy. You're stressed, recognize the feeling, focus on your breathing, and so on. And hopefully after a while, you are under sufficient control of your feelings after having practiced this pattern recognition for long enough that it's no longer as overwhelming as it was initially. Now, depression for many people is intimately tied to feelings of anxiety. For a long time, I thought that my own experience of anxiety and of depression was separate, that there were two different conditions. That there were two different conditions. But, each year that goes by, I reflect on, the difficult days that I have. And those days contain a feeling whose signature is not really possible to be reduced to either one or another diagnostic condition. And a lot of the time, for me and for many people I know, anxiety is depression and depression is anxiety. They happen at the same time. You are anxious and that exhausts you, and depression is exhausting because it either involves so much thinking that you are miserable, or it involves the absence of feeling, which is itself incredibly exhausting too. And all of this together is a very anxiety-filled experience. It feels, the depths of depression are very difficult to share with another person, what it feels like to be hopeless and maybe nihilistic or extremely pessimistic, cynical, whatever it is that you are going through. It's very difficult to communicate that to to someone who is trying to care for you, trying to love you. And this only compounds, I think, the feeling of loneliness and isolation that people have when they are depressed. Anxiety, I think, is a bit easier to communicate to other people because anxiety is contained in many dimensions of everyday life. People who are very well adjusted will feel anxiety on a regular basis. And I'm not sure that the same is true for depression. It seems like depression is more lonely and I guess not an everyday feeling. It's reserved for a particular kind of despair, of episodes of a particular kind of despair. So I had, for many years, as a very young person, been very anxious as a child, always very anxious, thinking about things too much, unable to sleep because I was thinking too much. And I suppose something that was very helpful for me as a late teenager was being able to sublimate all of this anxiety and redirect it towards something which, fortunately for me, ended up opening up many doors for me. And what I have in mind here is study. I was able to transform the anxiety that I felt and latch it onto something else. Now, this is something that's very common for anxious people, and it's something that's helpful because it allows you to do things. But the problem is you end up just plucking anxiety from one dimension of your life and depositing it elsewhere. And the underlying thing which motivates the anxiety in the first place either goes unnoticed, or it just, it relishes the kind of constant change in what the anxiety is being attached to. So, I guess I'm still a relatively anxious person, much less than before, but I can tell that when I really care about something, a lot of what indicates to me that I really care about it is that I become very anxious about it. Whether or not it's animate or inanimate, whether it's a person I really care about or a project I really care about. It's, often for me and for many anxious people, the thing that makes something meaningful is kind of wrapped up in dimensions of anxiety, or has, dimensions of anxiety in it. Now, I really struggled to respond to various kinds of conventional psychiatric interventions, talk therapy, behavioral therapy. I saw psychiatrists and psychologists and hypnotherapists and Chinese medicine practitioners and acupuncturists and, every possible, specialist, and if I was making progress at all, it was very slow until the SSRI. Now, there are many things that come from the decision. There are many further decisions that follow the decision to go on antidepressants. And that initial decision, it's time for me to try something else. It's time for me to, hopefully with the support of friends, family, and a psychiatrist or doctor, to try a pharmacological intervention. That is a very difficult decision once it's been made. At least for me, there have been many decisions that I've had to make to continue staying on antidepressants. One of the hardest decisions for me has involved resisting a feeling of failure that going on antidepressants is itself a kind of failure. Now, if you're an ambitious person, if you're a driven person, someone who wants to succeed, and, this is probably everyone, right? It's the motivation and care with which many of us approach things in our lives. It feels like there's a real loss of control when you go on antidepressants, because you are yielding to pharmacology and to pharmacy, to like strange, chemistry, which very few people understand. And I have found this to be an extraordinarily disorientating and upsetting thing to continue returning to very often. I think to myself, if only I had been able to move through my various mental health disturbances, if only I had been able to do that, in a way that was pure, in a way that was unimpaired, in a way that was, without chemical assistance. It feels there's something to me, if I think to myself, am I glad that I went on antidepressants? Well, yes, because I think I can't think of anything else that has had such a positive impact on my well-being on an everyday basis than an antidepressant. However, at the same time, that doesn't translate into me feeling comfortable being on them. It doesn't translate into me feeling pleased or relieved or proud that I have been able to move through these things that have caused me and, by virtue of their proximity to me, my friends and family, significant grief. And I find this to be an elementally sad kind of sequence of thoughts. It feels very sad in a weirdly abstracted way. It feels sad to know that I'm sad about being on antidepressants, There's like a very funny irony here that the antidepressant brings with it a certain kind of sadness that wasn't there before. And I think the sadness is common. Many people who I have spoken to about being on antidepressants have described a feeling of, self-betrayal, a feeling of having given up too soon, a feeling of not having been strong enough, of having lost who they once were, and as a result of being on a chemical, now being this totally different thing. And the hardest part always is trying to tell yourself that you're okay and that everything will be okay. And it always is. That's one of the greatest mysteries of, that's one of the hardest things for the anxious and depressed mind to grapple with, the fact that each time things have gone wrong and things have felt like they were falling apart, they haven't. And, you've woken up and your friends are still there and you still love them and they still love you and your family is there. It's amazing. It's an amazing kind of comedy of surprise, really. But with all of this said, even though I know when I have tried to come off antidepressants, it has been horrible. Even with, kind of seeing my psychiatrist twice a week for checkups, and during periods where I've been coming off the antidepressants, I would go twice a week for an hour each time. And I can't describe the pain that I felt. Even recently, I tried to come off antidepressants at the start of 2023. And for 8 months, the 8 months that I was off them, were some of the worst months of my adult life. And I've had some, as all of us, we've all had some very bad times. But yeah, that feeling, there's a feeling of fear, a very real fear I have of kind of being trapped on this medicine for the rest of my life. My psychiatrist, fortunately, has tried to, reassure me that I'm a young person, whatever this means, and that there is time, and I'm still learning how to deal with, my psychological afflictions and getting better as the years go by, and all of this is true. But what doesn't go away is the doubt. I think once a person has been very deeply sad and very deeply anxious, I think there is something, to me, it feels like there is something that fractures in the mind, which makes it very difficult to trust that everything will be okay. And so, yeah, I think having seen my own, quite rapid psychological deterioration, which I think can be very closely tied to coming off antidepressants. I feel sad that I'm on them, and I feel terrified to be off them. And this is I'm allowing myself to talk about this because it's something that causes me grief, and it's something that I believe is really important. But it's also very important for me not to think about this too much, because it's not important, really, and it's distressing. And I think that anxious people tend to think too much about, the trap of anxiety is that an anxious person has a very powerful mind, which is too good at recognizing patterns everywhere. And so it's very easy to trick yourself into thinking that everything is real, which is in your mind, all of these patterns that you're recognizing, of course, the thing, your greatest fear, it's about to come true, and so on. And there is a way to interrupt that, and each person, I suppose one of the great undertakings of being a person is trying to figure out how to interrupt your own thoughts without, destroying your mind in the process. And what I do is I either go to sleep or I go outside or I see my friends. Reliably, these things help, especially when you do them, kind of, I was going to say at the same time, but, go on a walk with a friend like that. There's nothing really like that for me. And I encourage any of you who suffer from anxiety or depression and who are also on antidepressants to reflect on how that has been for you. And I also encourage those of you who have friends who are anxious and depressed, to ask them what they need. Not only when they reach out and say, I'm really distressed, but, when things are going well for someone, ask them what they need. And when things are going well for you, take stock of what is happening in your life. But also ask yourself, if I stop feeling this way, how can I reassert myself back into whatever it is about this particular good moment? How can I continually reach towards that? How can I continually, remind myself that everything will be okay, that I can feel joy, that I am loved. Very basic things, you know. The more I talk about my own feelings of sadness and stress, you know, the more I realize that the things that I believe I need and that we all need are, you know, kind of what a baby needs. They're very fundamental things, and it's very sad that as adults we, for a combination of reasons, political, economic, social, we estrange ourselves from these really elementary needs. So much, we do this so much that we end up developing major depressive disorders, and we have generalized anxiety disorders that span for decades. We have people who are incredibly lonely, and we keep asking ourselves, you know, what is the answer? The answer must be so complicated. You know, I'm such a complicated person. To resolve these complicated tensions, there must be complicated answers. But the answers are not complicated. What is complicated is accepting that the answers are very straightforward and that they are not immediate, but they emerge gradually by doing things that you love with people who you love. So yes, these are my reflections coming after, I believe this will be around about 5 years that I've been on antidepressants, which it's been a good 5 years, I think, and it's good to be back on the podcast. I released 100 episodes on my previous podcast and then stopped for no reason, and now I'm back, and it's good to be back. Thank you for listening or watching. If you're watching, this will also be on YouTube. As I said, Patreon, like, subscribe, share, tell your friends, tell your mom, tell your dad. And you can follow me on social media. Links will be in the bio. So I'll see you in the next episode. Thanks for your time. Have a lovely day.